This morning, I walked out to find every one of my 100-year-old eucalyptus trees lying dead across my cabin property. Sylvia, our HOA president with a god complex and a clipboard, had finally done it. I thought that was the end. But then, 2 weeks later, the feds rolled in and marked the entire area as a federally protected flood zone, and Sylvia, she absolutely lost her mind. Said, and I quote, "This is impossible." Honestly, I didn't even know what was coming next. But it unraveled fast. If you've ever had a run-in with HOA nonsense, drop your story in the comments. I'd love to compare notes. This is QA Stories. Let's get into it. This morning, I stepped outside and saw my century-old eucalyptus trees hacked down. Sylvia, our power-drunk HOA president, had finally done it. 2 weeks later, the feds showed up, and Sylvia lost her mind. I should probably start by telling you who I am and why any of this matters. My name is Marcus Reed, and I'm what you might call a weekend warrior, architect by day, landscape photographer whenever I can escape the city. About 5 years ago, I bought this rustic cabin property in a place called Willow Creek Estates, thinking I'd found my perfect little slice of heaven. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at, just a simple wooden structure that probably hadn't been updated since the 1970s, but it was surrounded by these magnificent old-growth eucalyptus trees that had been standing there for over a century. The golden hour made the canopies glow, casting shadows across the old cabin walls. That place was timeless. I'd spend entire weekends there, just sitting on the front porch with my camera, watching the way the eucalyptus leaves would dance in the breeze and create these constantly shifting patterns of light and shadow. I know I probably romanticized it more than I should have, but some mornings I just sit there thinking, if I don't protect this, who will? It felt like something older than I could ever be, and way bigger than me too. The property was different from everything else in Willow Creek Estates, and honestly, that's what I loved most about it. While my neighbors had these perfectly manicured lots with their regulation grass, heights, and color-coordinated flower beds, my cabin sat nestled among these ancient giants that served as a natural windbreak and gave the whole place this timeless, almost magical feeling. Sometimes, I'd catch myself wondering how many storms these trees had weathered, how many seasons they'd witnessed, and what stories they could tell if they could speak. But at the time, I was just grateful to have found my sanctuary, completely unaware that I was about to meet someone who viewed my peaceful retreat as a personal affront to her vision of suburban perfection. That's when I first encountered Sylvia Thornton, our HOA president, and what I can only describe as a human hurricane of bureaucratic fury. She looked like a DMV form turned human, bun tight enough to cut glass, clipboard fused to her hand. She had these cold, calculating eyes that seemed to catalog every potential violation the moment she looked at your property, and she was never, and I mean never, seen without her official HOA clipboard clutched in her perfectly manicured hands. I later learned that she'd been a city planning assistant before moving to Willow Creek, which explained her encyclopedic knowledge of regulations and her absolute obsession with what she called maintaining property standards. But really, what Sylvia had was a control problem, and she treated our little HOA like her personal kingdom where every blade of grass needed her royal approval. She had this way of speaking in bureaucratic language that made even the simplest request sound like federal legislation. And she wielded the HOA bylaws like a weapon designed to crush any hint of individuality or natural beauty that didn't conform to her sterile vision of suburban perfection. The first time I really understood what I was dealing with was the Bougainvillea incident, and honestly, I still can't believe how petty the whole thing was. I had planted this gorgeous purple bougainvillea hedge along my front yard. Nothing crazy, just something that would add a splash of color and complement the natural beauty of the eucalyptus trees. My hedge was 4 feet tall. Her rule said 4.5. She rewrote it the next day to catch me. Well, apparently Sylvia didn't appreciate my landscaping choices because within 48 hours of planting that hedge, I received an official HOA letter informing me that I was in violation of the maximum height restrictions for decorative plantings. I wasn't sure if I was losing my mind or if she'd actually changed the rules specifically to target my innocent little flowering bush, but the timing was so suspicious that even my most trusting neighbors started raising eyebrows. I remember standing in my driveway, holding that letter, and staring at Sylvia's massive cactus garden. The irony wasn't lost on me, and when I mentioned this discrepancy to one of my neighbors, they just laughed and said, "Guess the HOA wants to level everything down to grass height around here." But what really bothered me wasn't the hypocrisy, though that was annoying enough. It was the way Sylvia would drive past my cabin property and just stare at those eucalyptus trees. Every single time. Her car would slow down as she passed, and I could see her cold eyes lingering on my beloved trees, like she was already planning something. There was something predatory about the way she looked at them, like a hunter studying prey. Honestly, at one point I wondered if she was measuring those trees with her eyes, like they were enemies of the state. I'd laugh if I wasn't so creeped out. I started wondering if I was being paranoid, but the intensity of her stare was unmistakable, and I got the distinct feeling that she viewed my trees as some kind of personal challenge to her authority over the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. What I didn't realize at the time was that this was just Sylvia's opening move. The bougainvillea incident wasn't really about maintaining community standards or property values. It was about testing me, seeing how much resistance I'd put up when she started exerting authority over my unique cabin property. And unfortunately for both of us, I completely failed that test. Instead of standing my ground and fighting back, I meekly trimmed my hedge to the required height and hoped that would be the end of it. Maybe I should have just walked away from the whole situation right then, I don't know. But watching her cold eyes linger on my beloved trees every time she drove past, I realized this was just the beginning. I had no idea how far she'd go to bring my cabin property under her control. The official letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I knew it was bad news the moment I saw that familiar HOA letterhead in my mailbox, but nothing could have prepared me for what Sylvia had written inside. In her typical bureaucratic language, she was demanding the complete removal of all eucalyptus trees on my cabin property to censure community sightlines and maintain the refined aesthetic expected in our development. Community sightlines? For what, the backs of identical beige garages? These trees had been standing on this property for over a century, long before there was even a development here, and now suddenly they were obstructing someone's view? That same day, I got another letter, this time a notice of fine for $280. The reason? Improper hedge placement posing visual disruption to neighboring lot lines, whatever that means. The whole thing was absolutely insane, but what made it even worse was that I could see right through her official justification to what this was really about. Sylvia wanted to control the most unique property in Willow Creek Estates, and my trees were standing in her way. The letter was written with a kind of cold professionalism that made it sound like she was doing me a favor by giving me the opportunity to voluntarily destroy everything I loved. Her tone shifted fast from friendly reminder to legal action pending in under 2 weeks. Sylvia had this way of escalating her bureaucratic pressure that was honestly kind of impressive in its calculated cruelty. Each letter was perfectly formatted on official HOA stationery, complete with references to specific bylaws and regulations that supposedly gave her the authority to demand tree removal from my cabin property. I tried reading through the actual HOA contract to understand my rights, but honestly, it was like trying to decipher ancient hieroglyphics. The whole document was written in this impenetrable legal jargon that seemed specifically designed to confuse and intimidate regular homeowners who just wanted to live peacefully. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but the whole situation was making me feel helpless and angry in ways I hadn't experienced since I was a kid getting bullied on the playground. The worst part was realizing that I'd essentially signed away my property rights without even understanding what I was agreeing to. And now Sylvia was using that contract like a weapon against everything I cherished about my cabin retreat. The breaking point came when Sylvia called an emergency HOA meeting to address what she termed non-conforming landscaping issues affecting community standards. I should have known it was going to be a disaster, but I still showed up at the community center that evening, naively thinking I could defend my trees with logic. The meeting room was set up like a courtroom, with Sylvia positioned at the head table, wielding her ceremonial gavel like some kind of judicial weapon. When my turn came to speak, I tried to explain, respectfully, why those eucalyptus trees were important to me and to the natural character of the property, but every time I made a point, she buried it under some rule I'd never heard of, like debating a fax machine, I swear. The gavel she used sounded louder when I spoke, like it was calibrated just to shut me up faster. It was like watching a masterclass in institutional manipulation. And I was completely outmatched by someone who'd clearly spent years perfecting these tactics on other defenseless homeowners. Walking home from that meeting, I felt more defeated than I'd ever felt in my adult life. I went straight to my computer and started typing this angry email to Sylvia, laying out exactly what I thought of her tactics and her manufactured authority. But halfway through writing it, I realized how powerless I actually was in this situation. She had the HOA bylaws on her side, she had the procedural knowledge to outmaneuver me at every turn, and worst of all, she had the tacit support of neighbors who were too afraid of becoming her next target to stand up for what was right. So I deleted that email, started typing another one, then slammed my fist on the desk in frustration. Maybe I should have sent that first email. I don't know. But at the time, it felt like Sylvia had won before the real fight had even begun, and I was just some amateur trying to play in a professional league of bureaucratic warfare. I sat there wondering, am I just being stubborn, or is this what losing feels like? Knowing you're right, but watching everyone pretend you're wrong. People stopped making eye contact. Even the guy with the plastic flamingos looked away. Other residents would avoid eye contact when they saw me around the community, like supporting me might somehow make them complicit in whatever violation Sylvia was accusing me of. I understood their fear. Nobody wanted to be on the receiving end of Sylvia's bureaucratic wrath, but it still stung to realize that I was completely on my own in this fight. The few neighbors who did approach me would whisper their support when they were sure Sylvia wasn't watching, but none of them were willing to stand up publicly or attend meetings to voice their concerns. It was like living in some kind of suburban police state, where everyone was afraid to speak up against the person who controlled their property values and daily lives. That's when Sylvia's final letter arrived, the one that really showed me what kind of person I was dealing with. She claimed there were no legal restrictions preventing tree removal on my property, and, as evidence, she included what she said was the current area's zoning map. But something about that map felt wrong to me, even though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. Looking at that map more closely, I noticed it was dated 1992, which seemed like a strange choice for determining current property regulations. Why would she use a map that was over 30 years old to justify removing trees from my cabin property? I wasn't sure if I was grasping at straws, but the whole thing felt suspicious in a way that I couldn't shake. That's when my neighbor Walter, this quiet, retired guy who rarely spoke to anyone, casually mentioned something that would change everything. He was watering his garden when I walked by, still fuming about Sylvia's latest letter, and then Walter said something strange. I remember FEMA marking this zone decades ago. I froze. Walter was a retired water engineer who'd spent most of his career working on flood management projects, and he rarely talked about his professional background. But something about the way he said it made me stop dead in my tracks. Walter's words echoed in my mind as I stared at that 1992 map that night. Either he was remembering wrong, or Sylvia was hiding something big. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt a tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as powerless as I thought. I woke to the sound of chainsaws. Outside, my eucalyptus grove was falling, one by one. I couldn't move. I was staying at the cabin that weekend, and I woke up to this horrible mechanical roar coming from right outside my bedroom window. For a few confused seconds, I thought maybe it was construction noise from a neighboring property, but as I stumbled toward the window, my brain slowly processed what I was actually seeing. Multiple crews were systematically cutting down every single one of my eucalyptus trees, and these weren't small saplings, these were massive, century-old giants that had weathered decades of storms and droughts. Watching them fall was like witnessing a massacre, and I literally couldn't get my legs to work properly. I just stood there, shaking, with this awful ringing in my ears, while the natural windbreak that had protected my cabin for generations disappeared before my eyes. Each tree that crashed to the ground felt like losing a family member, and I found myself thinking about all the photographs I'd taken under their canopy, all the peaceful mornings I'd spent drinking coffee in their shade, and all the storms they'd weathered, only to be destroyed by one woman's bureaucratic vendetta. Later that week, a neighbor I barely knew muttered something odd. Bet she's clearing that view for the lakefront buyers. I didn't think much of it, but maybe I should have. The crews worked with ruthless efficiency, and within 3 hours, my entire wooded lot had been transformed into this barren wasteland covered in sawdust and scattered branches. My cabin looked naked. The shade was gone, just stumps and silence. The smell of fresh-cut wood was overwhelming, and everywhere I looked, there were these massive tree stumps that looked like tombstones marking where my beloved eucalyptus had once stood. Without those towering trees providing shade and shelter, the rustic wooden structure looked small and exposed, like it had been stripped naked and left vulnerable to the elements. I felt like I was going to throw up, and my chest was burning with this rage that I'd never experienced before. It was like someone had come into my home and murdered my family members while I slept, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. The crews wouldn't even make eye contact with me, just continued their systematic destruction while I stood there in my pajamas, helplessly watching my sanctuary being obliterated. But apparently, Sylvia wasn't finished twisting the knife. Later that afternoon, I received an email from her that was so shameless and cruel that I actually had to read it twice to believe what I was seeing. She billed me $1,200 for landscaping services. I laughed out loud. Then I nearly cried. I held the phone, hovering over the reply button. I wanted to say something, anything, but what do you even write to someone who bills you for murdering your trees? She had destroyed my trees and then charged me for the privilege of watching it happen. The email was written with the same cold professionalism as all her other correspondence, as if charging me for destroying my property was just another routine administrative task in her perfectly organized world of suburban tyranny. The community's reaction was about what I'd expected, which is to say disappointing but not surprising. A few neighbors approached me with these awkward expressions of sympathy, but nobody was willing to actually stand up and say that what Sylvia had done was wrong. They'd shake their heads and mutter things like, "Such a shame about those beautiful trees." But when I asked if they'd be willing to support me at the next HOA meeting, they'd suddenly remember urgent appointments they had to get to. I understood their position. Nobody wanted to be Sylvia's next target, but it still felt like being abandoned when I needed support most. Even worse, when I tried to research legal options for fighting back, I discovered that the HOA contract really did give them broad maintenance authority over common areas and properties that affected community standards. I wasn't sure if I was reading it wrong, but it seemed like I had signed away most of my property rights without even realizing it. The legal language was so deliberately confusing that I started to understand why Sylvia felt so confident in her actions. She knew that most homeowners would never be able to navigate the bureaucratic maze she'd created to protect her authority. That's when Walter showed up at my door carrying this old briefcase that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. I wasn't expecting visitors, and honestly, I was in no mood for small talk about the weather or neighborhood gossip. But Walter had this serious expression on his face that I'd never seen before. And when he asked if he could come inside and show me something important, I could tell this wasn't a social call. He sat down at my kitchen table and opened that briefcase with the reverence of someone handling sacred artifacts. He used to work with FEMA, had maps, stamps, studies, all legit. And what he showed me changed everything. Walter explained that he'd been a FEMA water engineer back in the 70s and 80s, and he'd actually worked on the flood zone mapping for our entire region. I had no idea that our quiet neighbor had such an impressive professional background, or that he might hold the key to understanding why Sylvia had been so determined to remove my trees. According to Walter's documents, the cabin properties in Willow Creek, including mine, had been designated as a FEMA flood control zone since 1974. The original environmental studies showed that old trees with deep root systems, especially eucalyptus, were absolutely critical for preventing soil erosion and managing water runoff that could cause flooding in downstream communities. Walter spread out these official FEMA-stamped maps on my table and showed me exactly where my property fell within the protected zone boundaries. But here's the kicker. Federal law explicitly prohibits removing natural flood barriers from designated areas without proper environmental impact studies and federal approval. What Sylvia had done wasn't just against HOA regulations, it was potentially a federal crime. Walter explained that these trees weren't just decorative landscaping, they were part of a carefully designed natural infrastructure that protected thousands of people downstream from potential flooding. For the first time, I wasn't just a victim. I had proof, maybe even power. Holding those official documents in my hands, I felt like I'd been handed a weapon that could actually match Sylvia's bureaucratic arsenal. But I wasn't sure if I was brave enough to take on the federal government, and I definitely wasn't sure if I understood the legal implications of what Walter was showing me. Walter must have seen the uncertainty in my eyes because he leaned forward and said, "Marcus, those trees weren't just decorations. They were protecting all of us." The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. My personal fight to save my beloved trees had suddenly become something much bigger, something that could affect the safety and welfare of an entire community. But was I brave enough to find out if the federal government would actually care about one man's trees in a suburban development? That was the question that kept me awake all night, staring at Walter's documents and wondering if I was about to make everything worse or finally find the justice I'd been seeking. I never thought I'd spend my weekend reading FEMA codes like a law student cramming for finals. But here I was, and honestly, maybe it did. I'm not a lawyer, and I'd never had any reason to understand FEMA regulations before this whole nightmare began. But desperation has a way of making you learn things you never thought you'd need to know. What I discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The regulations were crystal clear about prohibiting alterations to natural terrain in designated flood control areas, and removing century-old trees with extensive root systems definitely qualified as an alteration. But navigating federal bureaucracy seemed almost as intimidating as dealing with Sylvia's HOA tyranny, and I kept wondering if I was about to make everything worse for myself. The more I read about federal environmental protection laws, the more I realized that this wasn't just about my personal property rights. There were serious legal consequences for anyone who violated these regulations, and I wasn't sure if I was prepared to be the person who brought that hammer down on our entire community. I picked up the phone, put it down, picked it up again. What if they blamed me for not stopping it? What if I just made everything worse? I must have picked up that phone and put it down a dozen times, running through scenarios in my head about how badly this could backfire. What if filing a complaint triggered some kind of investigation that ended up costing me my cabin property? The fear of making one wrong move and losing everything was almost paralyzing. Maybe I should have just accepted the loss and moved on. I don't know. But every time I looked out at those sad tree stumps scattered across my lot, I felt this burning need for justice that I couldn't ignore. The image of those magnificent trees crashing to the ground kept playing in my mind like a nightmare I couldn't escape, and I knew that if I didn't at least try to fight back, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. That's when I came up with what I thought was a strategy. It felt risky, maybe clever, maybe desperate. I honestly couldn't tell anymore. So I didn't write to FEMA as myself. I created a group email, willowcreek.citizens.alert@gmail.com. I phrased everything like it was coming from a group of residents, because if this was a war, I couldn't walk in looking like a lone soldier. Instead of filing a complaint as an angry homeowner seeking revenge against his HOA, I decided to approach FEMA as a concerned community member reporting a potential environmental violation. I figured that if I made it seem like the HOA itself was requesting federal intervention, or at least that multiple residents were worried about flood control issues, it might carry more weight than just one guy complaining about his trees. The psychological advantage was that Sylvia would never see it coming. She'd spent so much time and energy outmaneuvering me through HOA procedures that she'd never expect me to go around her completely and bring in federal authorities. It was like playing chess with someone who'd been focusing entirely on controlling the center of the board while I quietly moved my pieces into position for a completely different kind of attack. But I'll be honest, the plan made me nervous as hell, and I kept second-guessing myself constantly. Was I being too sneaky? Was this somehow dishonest or unethical? I'd never tried to manipulate government agencies before, and I had no idea if my strategy would work or completely blow up in my face. The uncertainty was killing me, but I kept thinking about those tree stumps and the smug satisfaction on Sylvia's face when she'd handed me that $1,200 bill. If she could use bureaucratic manipulation to destroy my trees, then maybe I could use the same tactics to fight back. At least, that's what I told myself when I finally worked up the courage to make the call. Part of me wondered if I was crossing some kind of ethical line, but then I remembered that she'd destroyed federally protected natural infrastructure without any regard for the law or the safety of downstream communities, and my conscience felt a lot clearer about what I was planning to do. Officer Cooper at the FEMA Environmental Compliance Division sounded exactly like what you'd expect from a federal bureaucrat. Tired, bored, and probably dealing with dozens of routine calls every day. When I introduced myself as a concerned Willow Creek cabin owner and started explaining the situation, I could practically hear him mentally checking out. He gave me these standard responses about filing paperwork and following proper procedures, and I got the sinking feeling that my call was going to disappear into some bureaucratic black hole where nothing ever gets resolved. But then, I mentioned the specific phrases that Walter had coached me on: cabin property flood zone, tree removal, and increased erosion risk downstream. When I said flood zone and eucalyptus removal, his tone changed. I could almost hear him sit up straighter. I suddenly felt like I'd cracked something open I didn't fully understand. Like I'd gone from complaining to detonating. It was like I'd accidentally said some kind of magic password that transformed him from a bored civil servant into a laser-focused environmental enforcement officer, The transformation was incredible, and honestly a little scary. One moment he sounded like he was reading from a script, and the next moment he was asking detailed questions about the location, the type of trees that had been removed, and whether I'd observed any signs of increased water runoff since the removal. When I mentioned that we were talking about century-old eucalyptus trees in a designated flood control zone, his voice became sharp and professional in a way that made me realize I'd stumbled onto something much bigger than just my personal grievance against Sylvia. Cooper told me that FEMA takes violations on wooded cabin properties very seriously, especially when they involve the removal of established flood barriers without proper environmental impact assessments. He explained that these kinds of violations could affect the safety of entire watersheds and that the federal government had zero tolerance for unauthorized alterations to protected natural infrastructure. He promised to dispatch a team within the week to investigate the situation. Hanging up that phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Genuine hope, mixed with the confidence that I wasn't completely powerless after all. But lying there, I couldn't tell if I'd just saved the neighborhood or signed my own eviction notice. Cooper's promise should have made me feel victorious, but instead, I found myself wondering what would happen if the federal investigation didn't go the way I hoped, or if Sylvia somehow managed to turn the whole situation around on me. Looking back, I wonder if I should have been more confident in that moment. But after everything Sylvia had put me through, I guess I'd lost the ability to trust that justice would actually prevail. 3 black SUVs rolled in like a government convoy out of a disaster movie, except this time, the disaster was HOA mad. I actually spilled coffee on myself watching it. For a second, I felt a weird mix of hope and pure dread, like I'd pulled the fire alarm and was now waiting to see what burned. It was a Tuesday morning and I was drinking coffee on my front porch when these vehicles pulled up to various locations around the cabin area, disgorging teams of serious-looking people in official windbreakers carrying equipment I'd never seen before. They had modern surveying instruments, commercial-grade drones, soil testing kits, and cameras that looked like they could photograph evidence from space. Watching them work was like witnessing a crime scene investigation. The evidence they were collecting had something to do with my destroyed eucalyptus trees. The professional efficiency of their operation was both impressive and slightly intimidating. These weren't local bureaucrats playing politics. These were federal agents conducting a serious environmental investigation. The federal team was incredibly thorough and professional in a way that made our local HOA drama seem petty and small by comparison. They systematically photographed every tree stump on my cabin property, took detailed measurements of the soil erosion around the root systems, and used their drones to capture aerial footage of the entire area. Porch lights turned on, curtains parted. People pretended to water their lawns while staring. I could see neighbors gathering on their front porches and whispering to each other as they watched the federal activity. And honestly, it felt pretty satisfying to know that Sylvia's little kingdom was suddenly under scrutiny from people who actually had real authority. But what really made my day was watching Sylvia's reaction when she first spotted those black SUVs. I saw her watering her cactus garden. Then she spotted the FEMA logo and dropped the can like it was radioactive. The woman who'd been so confident and domineering when she was destroying my trees was now clearly panicking. Sylvia tried to post in the community newsletter that FEMA's visit was routine collaboration. But Cooper shut that down in less than a day with an official statement. FEMA does not coordinate enforcement with private HOAs. For the next 2 days, Sylvia was basically invisible, which was unprecedented in our community because she usually made it her business to insert herself into every neighborhood activity or controversy. But I could see her through her windows, frantically making phone calls and pacing around her living room like a caged animal. I wasn't sure if I should feel vindicated or worried about what was coming next, but there was definitely a part of me that enjoyed watching her squirm for once. It was like watching a playground bully suddenly realize that the principal was watching their behavior, and all that artificial confidence was evaporating in real time. Everyone showed up. Even the guy who once called meetings a waste of oxygen. You could feel it. Something big was about to crack. The emergency HOA meeting Sylvia called for that Friday evening was packed in a way I'd never seen before. Usually these meetings attracted maybe a dozen residents who were either bored or had specific complaints to air, but this time the community center was standing room only. Everyone wanted to know what the federal government was doing in our neighborhood, and Sylvia was clearly struggling to maintain her usual authoritative presence. She tried to control the narrative by calling it a small misunderstanding with some cabin property paperwork, but her voice was shaking, and she kept glancing toward the door. When Mrs. Clara, this retired school teacher who'd never spoken up at a meeting before, asked directly about flood risks from cabin area deforestation, Sylvia's face went completely white. It was clear that she'd never expected anyone in the community to understand the environmental implications of what she'd done, and now she was facing questions she couldn't answer without admitting that she'd known about the federal restrictions all along. That's when I decided to drop my bombshell. I stood up, my hands were shaking, but my voice held steady. I said FEMA was investigating us for federal violations. The room went dead silent, and I swear I could hear Sylvia's heart stop beating. Her mouth opened, then shut. She blinked like someone slapped her with a legal textbook. Her face went through this incredible transformation, first flushed red with anger, then completely pale with what I can only describe as terror, and finally settling on this expression of pure hatred as she stared directly at me. I wasn't sure if I was being too dramatic, but it felt like watching a villain realize that their master plan was falling apart. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, other residents were openly questioning Sylvia's decisions and asking why she hadn't informed the community about potential federal restrictions on tree removal. The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted, and I could see that people were starting to understand that this wasn't just about my personal grievance, this was about environmental law. The power shift in that room was immediate and almost tangible. Sylvia, who'd been the unquestioned authority figure for years, was suddenly on the defensive, deflecting questions and trying to blame outside agitators for stirring up trouble. But nobody was buying it anymore, and I could see in people's faces that they were starting to understand the magnitude of what she'd done. When someone asked about the potential legal consequences for the HOA, Sylvia couldn't give a coherent answer, and her usual bureaucratic confidence had completely evaporated. I actually felt a little sorry for her in that moment, but then I remembered those tree stumps scattered across my property. I've told enough stories on QA Stories to recognize when someone's about to crack, and Sylvia was showing every warning sign of a person whose carefully constructed world was about to collapse around them. The official FEMA notice arrived in everyone's mailbox 3 days later, and it was like dropping a bomb on our entire community. The notice mandated a community-wide meeting regarding cabin property environmental compliance violation, and included language about potential federal penalties for unauthorized removal of natural flood barriers. Reading that notice, I felt like I was holding a lit bomb in my hands, and I honestly wasn't sure if it was going to explode in Sylvia's face or somehow blow up in mine. The same people who once crossed the street now nodded in quiet solidarity. Sylvia's era was cracking, and I wasn't sure how deep the fault line ran. It wasn't just a meeting, it felt like a public reckoning. People who never showed up before were suddenly in the front row, notebooks in hand. We weren't just listening, we were watching someone fall. The mandatory community meeting that FEMA organized was unlike anything Willow Creek Estates had ever experienced. Officer Cooper showed up with a full presentation setup, complete with a projector, official charts, and enough documentation to fill a small library. The community center was packed beyond capacity, with residents who'd never attended an HOA meeting in their lives suddenly showing up to understand what kind of legal trouble their neighborhood association had gotten them into. I sat in the front row, partly because I wanted to hear every word, but mostly because I wanted to see Sylvia's face when the federal hammer finally dropped. The atmosphere in the room was tense and electric, like everyone could sense that something big was about to happen, but nobody was quite sure what to expect from a federal environmental investigation. Cooper didn't speak like a man giving a lecture. He spoke like someone testifying. Calm, clear, irrefutable. Cooper's presentation was devastating in its clinical precision. He explained that the cabin properties in Willow Creek had been designated as federally protected flood control zones since 1974, and he had the original environmental impact studies to prove it. Using drone footage that his team had captured over the past week, he showed how the removal of century-old eucalyptus trees had already begun to compromise the natural flood barriers that protected downstream communities. The soil erosion around my property was visible from aerial shots, and Cooper explained that this was just the beginning of what could become a serious environmental disaster if the damage wasn't immediately addressed and corrected. He used terms like watershed integrity and natural infrastructure that made it clear this wasn't just about landscaping preferences. This was about public safety and environmental protection on a scale that affected thousands of people. Then came the financial reality that made everyone in the room sit up and pay attention. The federal penalty for unauthorized removal of protected flood barriers was $85,000, plus mandatory replanting to federal environmental standards, plus ongoing federal oversight of all future landscaping activities on cabin properties. $85,000. I actually felt lightheaded. That number echoed in my skull like a fire alarm, except this one didn't just wake me up. It woke up the entire room. I could practically hear the collective gasp from every homeowner in the room as they realized that Sylvia's tree removal project was going to cost the HOA more money than most of these people made in a year. But Cooper wasn't finished. He explained that because the violation had compromised flood protection for the entire downstream area, all future landscaping on cabin properties would now require federal environmental impact assessments and FEMA approval. The room fell silent as people realized that Sylvia's actions had essentially put our entire community under federal oversight. That's when Sylvia completely lost it, and I mean completely. She'd been sitting at the head table, trying to maintain some semblance of official dignity, but as Cooper's presentation continued, I could see her psychological defenses crumbling in real time. At first, she tried to project forced confidence, interrupting Cooper to claim that this is clearly a bureaucratic error about some cabin trees that were removed for community safety. When that didn't work, she attempted to shift blame by insisting that residents had demanded the removal of those unsightly cabin property trees. But when Cooper calmly explained the legal framework that made her actions a federal violation, regardless of community complaints, Sylvia's composure completely shattered. Her hands trembled as she clutched the table edge. For a second, I thought she might faint. Or scream. Or both. The bun unraveled. The performance cracked. Her voice started rising, her hands were shaking, and you could see her realizing that all her bureaucratic knowledge and procedural manipulation tactics were useless against federal environmental law. The final straw was when Cooper announced the specific dollar amount of the federal fine. $85,000 hit Sylvia like a physical blow, and she actually stumbled backward in her chair. Her carefully maintained hair bun was falling apart. Her face was flushed red with panic and rage, and her voice started cracking as she desperately tried to maintain control of the situation. She began making these wild accusations about federal government overreach and claiming that Marcus, meaning me, had somehow orchestrated a conspiracy against the HOA. "You can't protect every cabin tree," she screamed at Cooper, her voice rising to a pitch that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. "This is impossible. These are just trees on private property." But Cooper just stood there calmly, watching her melt down with the professional detachment of someone who dealt with similar situations before. The contrast between his composed federal authority and her desperate emotional breakdown was almost painful to watch, like seeing someone's entire identity collapse under the weight of their own actions. The community's reaction was swift and merciless. Instead of rallying to support their embattled HOA president, residents immediately began demanding answers about why she'd hidden the federal designation, and whether she'd known that removing cabin trees would create flood risks for everyone. Mrs. Clara stood up and asked the question that everyone was thinking. "Sylvia, did you know about the federal restrictions when you ordered those trees cut down?" When Sylvia couldn't give a coherent answer, just more desperate accusations about outside conspiracies, Mrs. Clara called for an immediate no-confidence vote to remove her from the HOA presidency. Before the vote, Sylvia stood up and said, "I have emails proving Marcus orchestrated this to sabotage my position. Nobody even asked to see them. People just shook their heads." The motion was seconded immediately, and I could see the relief on people's faces as they realized they finally had a way to remove someone who'd clearly lost the ability to represent their interests responsibly. It didn't feel like a vote. It felt like an exorcism. When the count was read out, you could almost hear the room exhale, like a spell had been broken. The vote wasn't even close. 47 residents voted to remove Sylvia from office, with only 3 abstentions and 0 votes in her favor. I didn't celebrate or gloat when the results were announced. I just watched as this woman who'd terrorized our community for years bowed her head in complete defeat. The once powerful presence that had dominated our neighborhood meetings was now just a broken person shuffling toward the exit, her authority and credibility destroyed by her own arrogance and secrecy. As she reached the door, she turned back one last time with this look of pure hatred directed at me, but there was something pathetic about it now. Her reign was over, and everyone in that room knew it. The woman who'd wielded HOA regulations like a weapon against anyone who dared to challenge her vision of suburban perfection was now facing the reality that federal law trumped all her petty bureaucratic power games. But watching Sylvia leave that meeting in complete disgrace, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly the end. Maybe it was just paranoia after everything I'd been through, but something about her final look made me think she wasn't the type of person to accept defeat gracefully. The immediate aftermath of Sylvia's downfall was everything I'd hoped for and more. Within days, she'd gone from being the neighborhood's feared authority figure to a complete pariah that people crossed the street to avoid. The HOA board was completely reorganized with new democratic leadership that actually listened to community input instead of dictating arbitrary rules from above. Mrs. Clara was elected as the new president, and her first act was to review and simplify all existing HOA regulations, eliminating dozens of petty restrictions that had been added during Sylvia's reign of terror. The federal oversight that Cooper had promised turned out to be surprisingly helpful rather than intrusive, with FEMA providing guidance on environmentally responsible landscaping that actually enhanced property values. It was like watching our community emerge from years of authoritarian rule and rediscover what it meant to be a real neighborhood, where people actually cared about each other's well-being. Lawns looked a little messier, kids played outside again, but everything felt lighter, like we'd traded silence for life. But the $85,000 fine was the detail that really drove home the consequences of Sylvia's actions. When the HOA had to assess every homeowner for their share of the federal penalty, the community finally understood the real cost of allowing one person to wield unchecked authority over everyone else's property rights. One neighbor, the guy with the blue shutters, actually knocked on my door. "I should have backed you up," he said. "You were right, and we were all cowards." Neighbors who'd been afraid to speak up during Sylvia's presidency were now approaching me with genuine apologies, explaining that they'd wanted to support me but had been too intimidated by her bureaucratic retaliation tactics. I appreciated their honesty, even though part of me wondered how different things might have been if just one or two people had found the courage to stand up when it really mattered. The financial impact of the fine was significant enough that it forced every resident to confront their own role in enabling Sylvia's behavior, and I could see that people were determined never to let one person accumulate that kind of unchecked power again. The replanting project that FEMA mandated turned out to be one of the most positive developments. Instead of just replacing my eucalyptus trees, the federal environmental team designed a comprehensive flood management system that included multiple young eucalyptus specimens strategically placed throughout the cabin property area, along with native plants that would provide additional erosion control and wildlife habitat. Watching those new trees take root in the same soil where my century-old giants had once stood was emotional in ways I hadn't expected. They were small and vulnerable now, but I could already see the potential for them to grow into the same kind of majestic natural windbreak that had originally drawn me to this property. The federal replanting program also included educational components about watershed management and natural flood control. 3 months after Sylvia's removal from office, Willow Creek Estates had transformed into the kind of community I'd originally hoped to find when I bought my cabin property. Instead of living in fear of arbitrary rule changes and bureaucratic retaliation, residents were actually talking to each other, sharing concerns openly, and working together on projects that benefited everyone. The new HOA bylaws fit on 2 pages instead of the 40-page legal document that Sylvia had created to intimidate and control people. We started a community garden, launched a native plant initiative, and even began hosting monthly town halls where everyone had an equal voice, regardless of how long they'd lived in the development or how perfectly manicured their lawns were. Property values throughout the neighborhood actually increased once we received official recognition as an environmentally protected area, which was ironic considering that Sylvia had justified destroying my trees by claiming they were bad for property values. The for sale sign that appeared in front of her house wasn't surprising, but I was shocked when I learned she'd sold for significantly below market value just to get out of the community as quickly as possible. Part of me felt sorry for her. Losing your home and your reputation at the same time can't be easy for anyone. But then I'd remember that $1,200 bill she'd sent me for destroying my trees, and the sympathy would disappear pretty quickly. About a year later, I was out watering my now 6-foot-tall eucalyptus saplings when I saw an old sedan pull up to the curb. I couldn't believe it when Sylvia emerged from the driver's seat, looking exhausted and wearing casual clothes instead of her usual power suit uniform. She stepped out of her car like she wasn't sure if she'd be welcomed or stoned. Her HOA pin caught the sunlight, absurd and sad at the same time. She was still wearing her old HOA president pin, which struck me as both sad and slightly delusional. When she approached me, I wasn't sure what to expect, an apology, another accusation, or maybe just some kind of closure to this whole bizarre chapter. The fact that she'd driven all the way back to Willow Creek suggested that she had something important to say, but knowing Sylvia, I was prepared for just about anything. What she actually said caught me completely off guard. "I want to apologize," she began, but then immediately followed it with, "But you destroyed everything I built here with your cabin property drama." I actually had to stop and stare at her after that one. Was she seriously trying to apologize and blame me at the same time? When I pointed out that I hadn't destroyed anything, that she'd done that herself when she cut down federally protected trees, she doubled down on her victim narrative. "You think you won, but you just got lucky with some old cabin property paperwork," she said. I told her calmly, "I didn't destroy what you built, Sylvia. You did. I just stopped everyone from calling it community." I tried to explain that this was never about winning or losing, that it was about protecting what mattered, but she wasn't interested in hearing that perspective. Her visit felt like one last attempt to maintain some kind of moral high ground, even though she'd been the one who'd violated federal law and endangered our entire community's safety. Then she revealed something that finally made her motivations crystal clear. Those trees hadn't just been obstructing community sightlines. They'd been blocking the view from certain lakefront properties, and Sylvia had apparently been promised a real estate commission for improving those sightlines. And just like that, it all made sense. It was never really about community standards or tree heights. It was about money. Sylvia had targeted my eucalyptus trees not for aesthetics, but because they blocked views from certain lots she stood to profit from. Greed, plain and simple, wearing an HOA badge. Looking back, I should have seen the signs, but I was too busy trying to protect something I loved to realize what she was really after. 5 years later, those trees are thriving again. Kids climb them now. I even made a short doc called Rooted: When Communities Fight Back, and it's been shared in town halls and film festivals across the country. Turns out, our story helped other neighborhoods push back too. What I learned through all of this wasn't just about laws or bylaws. It was about the ripple effect one act of resistance can have. Sometimes you don't need a loud army, just one person brave enough to say no. If you've ever stood your ground when no one else would, or if you've tangled with an HOA like ours, tell me in the comments. I read them all. This is QE Stories. Thanks for sticking with me.
That's it for now from QA Stories. Make sure you're subscribed and the bell's on. The next story might just top this one.